The G20 summit in New Delhi ended on September 10th, with India handing over the bloc presidency to Brazil. This was the last G20 meeting, with the group effectively becoming the G21 after the African Union was admitted as a new member in a move that was proposed and led by India. The Indian side also surprised everyone by coming out with the G20 New Delhi Leaders Declaration a day ahead of schedule, when most experts thought the host would fail to drive consensus due to differences over the Ukraine war. The 2023 G20 summit made progress on multiple fronts, including climate financing for developing countries, reforms at multilateral development banks, facilitating restructuring of low income countries' debt, and the development of public digital infrastructure. There were compromises, and a lot of work remains. But the outcomes did bolster India's claim to be the voice of the global south and address concerns about G20's continuing relevance. Against this backdrop, we have with us Shyam Saran, former Foreign Secretary of India, to speak on what's next for India and the G20. Welcome to the Business Standard Morning Show, Mr. Saran, and thank you for joining us. Let's jump straight to the questions. What comes next for the G20, or should we call it the G21? Would you agree that it has proved its continuing relevance?
Yes, I think it does continue to be relevant because, after all, this is the only forum where the most important and affluent countries of the world and the major emerging economies of the world are represented. You know, it is said that 80% of the GDP of the world is represented, around the table. So any such gathering of such important countries obviously will have importance. It will have relevance. So I would imagine that this relevance, its importance, is likely to continue into the future. With regard to India and the role of the emerging countries, so far it might be correct to say that the agenda of the G20 and the proceedings of the G20 have been very much dominated by the affluent West, the major countries. So you see for example, focus on the Ukraine war, despite the fact that it is economic issues which must remain the focus of the G20, or even with respect to issues relating to finance or relating to development. The domination of the Western countries has been quite obvious. I think what is important is that if you take the Bali meeting, which was presided over by Indonesia, now you have had a summit which has been presided over by India. And the next two will be Brazil and South Africa. So you have four important summits which serially are going to be presided over by the four very important and, in a sense, influential, emerging countries and, in a sense, representative of the South. So this ensures that whatever gains which have been made in terms of having a more balanced agenda of the G20, reflecting more the concerns, the priorities and the aspirations of the countries of the South, in particular the major emerging economies. This particular trend which we have seen, particularly reflected in the proceedings of the New Delhi summit, I think this trend is likely to continue. So in a sense, you can also say that this is a reflection of the growing multipolarity that we see today in the world. But this is a propitious moment, in a sense, for the major developing countries.
The sense that I'm getting is that, the consensus that we were surprisingly able to forge on Ukraine, where we saw almost that perhaps the G7 even maybe conceded ground. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but that is the sort of sense that one got, that it was able to bring the bloc's agenda back to economics rather than geopolitics. Especially, it comes in the backdrop of the BRICS expansion, where people have said that expanded bloc and forum might even be a competitor to the G7 one day. So in that context, do you think it was also about the members being very cognizant of the fact that they need to maintain their relevance. Do you think that is what drove this?
Let me say right at the outset that I do not think that the BRICS, even in its expanded form, can really compete with the G20. They are simply not in the same league in a sense. BRICS, by its very nature, would become dominated by China. So it is no longer a kind of a multilateral, forum of the kind that the G20 is. So this is maybe a personal perspective, but I do not expect that the expanded, BRICS is likely to become a kind of a rival to the G20. Having said that, I think what is important is that if we take the Ukraine issue, which you referred to, what does this mean? That quite obviously there has been a major departure from the much stronger language which we saw in the Bali Declaration. So something has changed. The fact that this formulation has been quite significantly diluted, and you have seen the reaction of Ukraine, very disappointed by the wording. I think that represents more a decision on the part of the United States, and which also was able to influence the other West European and European countries, that we need to, accept this dilution as a price to be paid for making certain that India's moment in the sun, or India's coming out party in a sense, this is not in any way affected or hurt. Because, of course, obviously, if you did not have a consensus declaration, it would take something away from India's chairmanship or presidency of the G20. So I think it was a very conscious, deliberate decision on the part of the United States, and having persuaded the Western Europe that, yes, we may have to accept this dilution, but that is a price to be paid because of the much bigger equities that we have in our relationship with India. So I think that's the major cause. Of course, this is not to detract in any way from the tremendous amount of effort put in by the Indian diplomatic, negotiating team, the 200 hours that they spent in trying to get this consensus. So the fact that the Western countries decided to be persuaded, in a sense, by the Indian negotiators is a testimony to their persuasive skills, in a sense. But let us not forget the geopolitical backdrop to this. Why did this happen? It reflects the importance today that India has in a geopolitical sense for the United States in particular, but the West in general. And this, of course, relates to the growing concerns about China, the fact that the tensions between the two countries, US and China, are in fact increasing. The fact that Xi Jinping did not come to the summit as he was expected to. Maybe the idea was to take something of the shine away from India. Instead, we ended up with India, in fact, getting a bigger shine, getting a better spotlight on its leader than would have otherwise been the case.
So, it has been seen as New Delhi and India's coming out party. But at the same time, progress was also made on agenda items that were of interest to India. So our next question would be that how do we make sure that the progress that was made at the New Delhi summit, that it's taken towards concrete outcomes?
As you know, it has always been the case that India is extremely good at event management. It is able to put up a very, very, impressive show, and which it did in this case as well. I think it would be fair to say that this has been an unprecedented spectacle, a very colorful spectacle, and it has really dazzled not only Indians, but it has dazzled a lot of the foreign delegates also who have come to India for the summit. So the event has been great, even in terms of the management of the agenda, mobilizing consensus on various agenda items, as you mentioned, India did a great job. For example, getting African Union into the G20. I think the fact that India, proposed this, India mobilized consensus on this. Obviously, your stock amongst African countries has gone up. To that extent, if you are looking at a China-India rivalry in Africa, there is no doubt that there is now a plus for India, minus maybe for China. In that respect, I think India has done very well. You mentioned climate finance. You mentioned the reform of the MDBs. Also the how to deal with the indebtedness problem, particularly of African countries. There is also how to treat new technologies, artificial intelligence, digital economy, which is also of particular interest to India and an area where India has actually demonstrated considerable capability. So all these aspects, yes, there is a very forward-looking agenda. There is a very forward-looking action plan, even with respect to some of these items. But, always the question is, how are they going to be implemented? So here I see two challenges. One challenge is that, event we are good at, process we are not so good at. Because process means away from the, spotlight, lot of very, very hard work behind the scenes. You need to have bandwidth, you need to have capacity, human capacity, trained capacity to be able to translate this agenda into practical outcomes. Do we have that? That is one question to ask. The second question to ask is that in terms of many of the outcomes that we envisage, the wish list which has come out, it is still a wish list. Let us not forget that. This wish list requires the deployment of very significant financial resources. Now, where are those resources going to come up? Naturally, we look at the developed affluent countries to be able to pay the bills. You have today a very challenging global economic situation. Okay, there is inflationary, sort of pressures amongst most of the developed countries. You have high interest rate, which means, resources are more expensive. The global growth is rather stagnant. Overall trade is at a low ebb. So if you are looking at the overall sort of, let us say, the pie which is available, that pie is rather limited. Which is mainly the reason why, despite the even modest commitments which have been made by the developed countries, for example, for climate finance, $100 billion, what is $100 billion for the G7? And yet, it has not been delivered on. No. Now, so here we now have a climate finance agenda, which actually will require even greater, deployment of resources. Where is the money going to come from? That is a big question mark. So these are the challenges that we may have to deal with. One, are the resources enough available, internationally? And secondly, in terms of what role we can play to catalyze implementation, do we have the right kind of capacities within the country where we can actually, on a much larger scale, engage with actors in other countries? So, Brazil is taking over. What is it that we can do in order to, take forward the momentum which has been generated at Delhi? How can we help in that? And as I mentioned, there will then be South Africa. Having got the African Union in, is there some way in which we can really mobilize resources for Africa, which is in a very critical situation? Much of the political instability which you see is linked on the one hand to the indebtedness problem, but also linked in a very, very real way to the climate challenge. Desertification, the fact that there is drought in so many parts of Africa. So these are huge challenges. And we have to be, in a sense, modest about the capacities that we have. by ourselves to really deal with it. We may need to, sort of work with partners, other partners, to try and see whether we can really push the momentum forward.
So the sense that I get is that India has done well in managing the spectacle, in getting people together, but there's a long process ahead, and the devil will lie in the details. But at the same time, as you did say, we did manage the spectacle well. There was a diplomatic coup of sorts where we got the consensus on Ukraine. So, seeing that, how do you see India progressing from here on forward in terms of its engagement with the G20? And in terms of global geopolitics, what's next for India?
Yeah. So if I look at this in terms of, number one, the relationship with the United States of America, there is no doubt there has been a big push given to India-US partnership. So this is why I'm saying the fact that the United States of America actually decided to climb down on an issue which is of such importance not only to the US, but also to Europe, is actually reflective of the fact that it has, in a sense, doubled down on its bet on India. So that's very important in terms of, going forward. I see that India-US relationship is going to get stronger and much more substantive than it has ever been. Now, of course, the uncertainty there are the next elections in the US, because that might, sort of really muddy the waters. But other things being equal, this means that we are going to be seeing a much stronger partnership relationship between India and the United States. So this I see as a very clear demonstration, the Ukraine war. The second is, what does it mean with respect to India's relationship with China, which is a critical relationship. Now, other things being equal, Xi Jinping deciding not to come to India, if the idea was that this could take away some of the shine from its G20 presidency, actually it did the opposite, right? Even though you had the Chinese premier visiting India for the summit, this was his first visit to India, by the way, as the Chinese premier. But did he have any kind of publicity or any kind of exposure at all? Virtually none. So even if you say that China and Russia were able to get their way on Ukraine, they were not able to translate that into a more prominent presence at the G20 summit. In fact, they were virtually invisible, isn't it? So for China, this is unusual. They are usually the center of attraction at any international gathering. If Xi Jinping had come and there was to be a summit meeting with, say, Biden, much of the international focus would turn to that, isn't it? Or even if we were going to be meeting, say, the Prime Minister Modi against the background of the border issue, obviously there would have been a lot of focus on that. So he would have a tremendous amount of exposure at such a meeting. That did not happen. So what was China able to get out of this? I think my view is that this was a rather a misstep on the part of China. Rather than gaining anything from this, they have actually lost something in terms of diplomatic clout, particularly if the global south is important to China, then the fact that it was India which initiated and managed to get consensus for getting the African Union into the G20, I think obviously India is one up in that sense.
So actually, now that you mentioned China, we can't have you go without discussing what was perhaps one of the most important developments that came out of the summit. The announcement of the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, which is envisioned as a ship-to-rail transit network. So what are your thoughts on that, its feasibility, and is it a counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, I mean, in terms of geopolitics, there is no doubt that it is a counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative. But the project itself, there are question marks, obviously, because from India you are looking at shipping links to various ports along the Arabian coast. Those shipping links are already there. So what is it that additionally you are looking for? DP World, for example, is already a major player as far as port infrastructure in India is concerned. So what does this mean in terms of the shipping links that we are talking about from India to these ports? No railway line is envisaged for the India bit. It is only the shipping links. Now, yes, the shipping links which are envisaged will give India access to some of the key ports on the Mediterranean through the railway line, including, for example, Piraeus in Greece and Haifa in Israel. Now, is that a major plus point as compared to, say, traffic through the Suez Canal? I'm not so sure, whether this is economically viable or not. And I think those kind of estimates, calculations still remain to be done. How does this compare with existing, transportation networks? There is a political, element into this, because Biden did mention that, this particular partnership includes Israel. Now, at a time when the UAE, of course, is a part of that Abraham Accords, Saudi Arabia is not. Secondly, there is a kind of a détente taking place between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And certainly from the American point of view, this particular link will be seen as somehow bypassing Iran, right? So it has that geopolitical element. Does it mean that we are going to be looking forward to normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which has been envisaged, but it has not yet come about? Does this particular partnership mean that that is quite imminent? Remains to be seen. So yes, it has a political significance, but I'm not so sure that its economic viability has been carefully thought through. That's all that I can say at this point of time.
Thank you for joining us, Mr. Saran. Just to sum up, the sense that I get from what you've told us is that India had its moment. It delivered. It got consensus where consensus was considered to be very difficult, if not impossible. A lot of the agenda items that were of interest to it, we saw progress.
Of India.
Albeit with compromises, not in
particularly the digital infrastructure initiative.
Absolutely. So we saw progress, albeit with compromises. A lot of work remains to be done, but it seems that India delivered. I think that's the bottom line. What it set out to do, it delivered as far as the G20 summit in New Delhi was concerned.
Certainly. I mean, no doubt about that.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
If you like this video, share it and subscribe to Business Standard. For more news, views and insights, log on to www.business-standard.com. Do also follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram and LinkedIn.
He's about to land his dream job. Business Standard.